Hey, good morning, everyone. And it's a pleasure to see so many of you for this panel, which we did not at all expect to be holding in this hall, because it is quite an unorthodox panel and roundtable. Not all of the individuals on this stage are academics with a theoretical framework, regression analysis, or anything of that sort. And we are not part of a project that is presenting any kind of results. Rather, we're here to talk about this topic of English language journalism and its role in the Baltic independence struggle. And my name is Vello, Pettai, and I'm the chair, and will moderate some of this discussion. And the aim is that it speaks, we hope, to a number of themes, which is first and foremost, of course, the independence struggle, the defining event of the second half of the 20th for the Baltic nations, of course. But hidden in here is, of course, then further the word journalism, speaking in turn to media and to democratization because of the role of media and journalism in democracy. And last but not least, English language, meaning international relations in a way, and the way in which then journalism was a part of the independence struggle, but vis-a-vis the outside world. So you see this kind of triangulation of topics and themes that we hope to address here. However, why are we then on the stage? Well, we are actually all people who were involved with an English language newspaper in the late 1980s and early 1990s, namely the Estonian Independent, or first and foremost Homeland, then Estonian Independent, and then the Baltic Independent. And this series of English language newspapers appeared from 1985 to 1996. And so we're not here, of course, just because we're having a reunion of old comrades and old veterans. Rather, we, as I said, want to use this occasion to talk perhaps a little bit more deeply about these issues. So I'm going to give a few introductory remarks, and then the other panelists will follow with their perspectives, and I'll introduce them also individually in just a moment. But to give you the actual technical background, the empirical background, so we're talking in part about this first version, Homeland. We have actual copies if you really want to see them in a show and tell later on. But this was an English language insert to a Soviet Estonian newspaper called Kodumaa that was then used as a kind of propaganda rag starting in 1985 and then until then 1990. And the person who should also be on this stage, Tarmo Tammerk, was actually one of the editors and journalists for Homeland from the beginning. He led this whole process throughout this period, but unfortunately he's not able to be with us today to talk about some of this, but we have some of his reflections that we will share with you in the course of the panel. So Homeland was the first iteration, then came this Estonian Independent, which was then created from the Homeland, a 4-page newspaper, as you can see, that was launched in I think it was April of 1990. And then last but not least, it became the Baltic Independent because, of course, we wanted to conquer the market and become Baltic-wide in terms of what was going on. So this is the simple background to it. And eventually, the Baltic Independent merged with a competitor, the Baltic Observer, to become what is still today the Baltic Times. But we will be not going that far in our discussion because that's just a separate group of people and phenomenon. Now, why are we talking about this? And I've hinted already at some of the sort of deeper this panel. One is, of course, this personal dimension. We were involved in this. We're not all gray-haired yet, but we all, as time goes by, begin to reflect and think about what has happened in the work that we did in those early years. There's also, of course, a historical relevance to this. I'm excited and ecstatic about the fact that coming to this event, in contrast to the first one in 1995 in Riga, where I was also present, there is now a whole new generation of younger scholars here including historians who are looking at the period that I'm talking about from an historical lens. And therefore, we're interested in engaging with people who may be interested in that period of time, but from a different disciplinary perspective. We also want to give, I think, a bit of retrospective meaning to what was done in this particular sphere of the independence struggle, of social life, of journalistic life, of international connection between the Baltics and the rest of the world, and what all of that can say about the changes that took place. And lastly, we have, I think quite interestingly, a number of interdisciplinary perspectives. I will be speaking as a political scientist, others as historians, journalists, analysts, and so forth. So in that sense, we also want to bring diversity into this mix. Now comes the social science part, positionalities. Ooh. This is the effort to show you, as part of my own, at least my own reflections, and that we have a number of interesting perspectives on what was going on in that period. And I'm not trying to put people into a box, but I think that it is interesting to draw attention to some of these things. Of course, I've already mentioned, was the editor-in-chief and was the, to put it very simply, the real Estonian in the room the whole time. I mean, he was completely, educated, born, and worked in Estonia throughout this period, and still today is now media ombudsman for the Estonian National Broadcasting Service. And so he was from the beginning until the end, and I think this is an important perspective, and it's so disappointing that he's not here, but we will hopefully reflect some of his views. I myself, of course, came in 1989, 1990, helped Tarmo actually to carry out the transition from homeland to the Estonian independent organizationally and what have you. But came from the United States as not even a graduate student at that time, just sort of a adventure-seeking emigre Estonian. I know there are others of those like me in the room. So this was an exciting time to see what was going on in Estonia and work as a journalist and gain access to it. Brad Woodworth, who will speak then after me, was also a young researcher at the time, but coming from someone purely from the United States with no direct Baltic background, but just a keen interest in what was going on in the region, and decided also to be a reporter to see what was going on. Fourthly, then, Lisa Trei, who has also Estonian emigre background, but had been working already as a professional journalist and came to Estonia wanting to report and reflect and talk about what was going on for that international audience. And later developed, or quite soon thereafter upon her arrival, developed also a side stream of activity as a lecturer at the University of Tartu on journalism. So she was very much embedded in the journalistic world, much more than, and the journalistic community, more than perhaps Brad and myself. And last but not least, Edward Lucas, who was a correspondent for the Independent newspaper, and later worked also for The Economist, and has now become independent or scholar and working at different institutions, and has gone on to written books about the region and other things, that was also, a mentor for what we were doing as a fully established, awe-inspiring British correspondent, but also later became even institutionally, organizationally involved as a shareholder in our organization. So again, each of you, please speak to more roles that you had, but I wanted to use this occasion to draw attention to the diversity of who we were and what we were doing. Don't want to go on too long, but there's just a few of these evolutionary stages. I've already shown you the different kinds of newspapers that we had, so those three titles, if you will. But there's also further breakdown in terms of the way in which Homeland, when it was created in '85, was deep during the period of albeit Gorbachev, but still, not perestroika in full swing. And as Estonia's own events took shape in 1988, 89, then Homeland actually, because it was English, was able to reflect things much more liberally, and Tarmo was one of the people pushing that agenda under the radar of the censors and other authorities. And then when we were able to actually create the Estonian Independent, the rest of Estonia also exploded with independence declarations and a number of political events. And so we were there trying to channel this information into the external world and even develop a business out of it. We had, and we haven't mentioned Kevin Probert, who was here in the UK serving as a kind of business manager for us and receiving subscriptions, which were rolling in every day, I remember, in 1990. I think we were up to several hundred issues then and subscriptions in a relatively short period of time. But as in terms of what we were actually doing, it was trying to follow some of this and not just serve as cheerleaders for Estonia, but also to serve as that intermediate channel of information. By 1991, of course, you know that things were sort of, for some people, dragging on very long, right? The independence declarations had been passed and nothing seemed to be happening. But then, of course, came the denouement with the coup, and so there's an element there where these English language newspaper had to reflect on that issue. And after that, it's sort of then, how do you keep up interest? How do you keep up the whole attention and yet follow the course of consolidation of independence and democracy. And I guess, by the mid-1990s, it's all about keeping the Baltic states in focus, which they still were and they still are today. But that was, I think, one way of characterizing the role of this newspaper and other media at that time. Oops, I had something there, but okay, well, I've already mentioned the merger. What I want to conclude here with, from a political science perspective, because that's the only thing I know how to talk about, is the question of sort of media and democracy, right? What reflections could one have? And what comes back to me from that basic year-long period that I worked there. I left in December of 1990 to start my graduate career. So in this sense, it was fascinating in retrospect to think about the ways in which, and to observe how journalists were interacting with democratizing leaders and first democratic leaders, how they were asking questions, how formalistic was it in many cases, what were the different range of generations asking questions, not asking questions, how much were they probing or not, and were they asking sort of critical questions or not. This is a wide range, of course, so there's a lot of research perhaps to be done here, but also this kind of difference across media forms. I think this is, for anyone who's a media studies person in the room, this is an obvious thing to say, but how were print journalists, television journalists, radio journalists working? We were monitoring also the differences in these types of media and where we were getting information that we could report in English, but also see how they were working. And in many cases, I think we were not necessarily an avant-garde, but we were perhaps asking more interesting questions than others. But to see also that this early creation of accountability in the interaction between the media and the early leaders. Ultimately, of course, we cannot say that the Estonian Independent had a profound or long-lasting effect on democratization in Estonia or the Baltic states more generally. Because in the end, we were sort of, as they say, ni riba ni miasa, right? We were neither fish nor fowl. There we go, the proper language for the occasion. And we couldn't necessarily, influence one or the other side. The external nor the internal, but we had a kind of interesting place in the middle between Estonian journalists who often look to us and like, wow, you're the ones who are reflecting some kind of Western journalistic practices in our midst, And we were embedded in the Estonian Telegraph Agency, which was the Estonian national news agency. So we interacted with them, we interacted with any number of other Estonian journalists, but we also had a fair amount of interaction with, of course, the Western media, and spoke to them as they passed through the Baltics looking for interesting articles in those years. So those are really the first thoughts that I have, but I will be coming back to those things and others in just a moment. And I think I will then, in that respect, pass the floor on then to Brad Woodworth, who will speak to us from his historian perspective, and I'll get the right one up. And he has lots of stuff to show, so off you go.
Let's see. Thank you, Vello. The greatest writer in the English language on totalitarian of the 20th century, on totalitarian regimes, George Orwell wrote, "Contrary to popular belief, the past was not more eventful than the present. If it seems so, it is because when you look backward, things that happened years apart are telescoped together. It is largely because of the books, films, and reminiscences that have come since that the past is now supposed to have had some tremendous epic quality that the present one lacks." So this is my attempt to take us all down just a peg, because Vello did highlight here the degree of personal dimensions involved in this project that we're talking about. That is that it was substantial in all of our lives. But he also mentioned historical relevance, and I will focus on both, particularly this word from Russian and Soviet history that Vello used, and that is perestroika. The birth and early years of the Estonian independence came in a particular period of time that made that possible, that in fact made the restored independence of Estonia and Latvia, as well as Lithuania, possible. And this was the reforms carried out in Moscow by the head of state of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. The years of the Estonian independence and the Baltic independence were also rooted in a particular place. This place. So if any of you, any of you who are Estonians here will know this building, Ajakirjandusmaja, or the press building, Dom Pettai, that's what Ajakirjandusmaja is a calque of, and you see it right there in Russian, Dom Pettai. And it was here's the building today. It's not quite as grand somehow as in our memories. It's located on Pärnu-Maantee, 67A, about 1.5 kilometers southwest of the center of Tallinn. The reforms that Gorbachev, I'll go back here. The reforms that Gorbachev introduced were vast, involving the administration of the republics of the Union, the economic ties between the peripheries and the center, perestroika, and reforms within the Soviet communitive culture as well. These latter changes described best by, of course, the word that Gorbachev used, and that was glasnost, avalikustamine in Estonian, or openness. I want to stress that this does not mean that the independence of Estonia was the result of actions taken in Moscow. This independence was the result of the work of Estonians and others in Estonia in the late 1980s through 1991, in the same way that independence in Latvia and Lithuania was the result of the work of those countries' peoples. But perestroika was the historical context, and I would argue the initial, if not engine, then the enabler of these restorations of independence, as well as for the independence that came in 1991 to the 11 other non-Russian former Soviet republics. Gorbachev's aim through perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness, or transparency, another translation of the word, was to revitalize the Soviet Union. That was Gorbachev's aim, which certainly meant, of course, keeping it together. In this, he certainly failed. Gorbachev's actions as a failure, for those of you that read and maybe perhaps teach in this area of the world more broadly, know that this meme of failure is an increasingly common approach to his time as head of the Soviet Union. This is the view given in a recent, overall well-reviewed, widely reviewed addition to the literature on this topic, and that is Vladislav Zubok's book, Collapse, the Fall of the Soviet Union, published by Yale University Press in 2021. For Zubok, events in the Baltic in 1988 and 1989 was when Baltic nationalism, that's his term, Baltic nationalism raised its head. For Zubok, it was Republican nationalism, particularly in the Baltic, that Gorbachev empowered. And this, together with the troubles in his economic reforms, were what that opened the gateway to economic and political crisis. It's clear that the changes Gorbachev was bringing to the USSR through his ideas for glasnost and perestroika provided the peoples of the Soviet republics an opportunity. And this has been widely, of course, this is maybe even just common knowledge, but it's something we should really reflect on. In her recent book, Politics of Uncertainty, the United States, the Baltic Question, and the Collapse of the Soviet Union, Una Bergman states clearly, the rise of Baltic independence movements was the unexpected result of Gorbachev's reforms. In the context of constantly shifting boundaries between the possible and the permissible, Baltic societies found themselves constantly testing the limits of perestroika. Bergman points out that the early names for the Popular Front movements that began in 1988 initially even had the word perestroika in their titles, at least in Estonian and Lithuanian. In Estonian, rahvaline perestroika toetuseks, in Lietuvos persitvarkymos sąjūdis. So I propose that we see Gorbachev and the success of his project not as coterminous with the collapse of the Soviet Union. In this view, perestroika was something that the Balts, who certainly did not want a continuation of the Soviet Union, could put to their own use and effectively did so. So in my remarks here, I will focus on what I saw myself in my work in the Estonian Independent, and this was efforts in part of this broader historical movements for all of the peoples who for decades had lived under rule from Moscow. My reflections involve a kind of dual vision, that is one that follows a narrative focused on Estonia and its people, because that's where I was, where we all were, but one that also follows a geographically broader swath, because I came to Estonia after initially beginning training as a historian of the Russian Empire. For perhaps all of us on this panel, what we present here is simply part of our lives. We worked on this amazing newspaper in a historically significant time, which makes our own work and our own lives part of this historical story. The dual nature of my own vision was rooted not in any ideological or political ideas or convictions, but simply in my own lived human experience. I first came to the Baltic in 1982, when I found myself living in Finland for a period of time, a year and a half, lived and worked with Finns. I spoke and learned Finnish fluently. Then I went back to the university, started studying Russian, and will admit I fell in love with the language. And with a young woman I met in class, and this was Trei Woodworth, who some of you here knew, who became my wife, and much later after we lived in Estonia in 1991, and then again in 1997-98, later became a Yale-trained historian. Trei unfortunately passed away in 2013 from cancer. So my own life experience in the Baltic combines multiple perspectives, not unlike perhaps the experience of many people themselves in the region. With me, though, there was a difference. As Vello mentioned, I do not have family or blood connection to any of the peoples of the Baltic or the broader Soviet Union. So I was, in a sense, an outsider. Though once my Estonian language skills were good, I did often feel like I was an adopteeritud väliseestlane, which means adopted Estonian from abroad. So in the summer or early fall of 1990, I saw a copy of the Estonian Independent here in this building. Well, which, again, any of you have spent time in Tallinn will know this is the Viru Hotel, where there was a kiosk with some periodicals from outside the USSR, such as the Herald Tribune, published in France, which contained articles from the New York Times and the Washington Post I was interested in. This is long before the internet was created, of course. And so I looked up an address. Let's see. I found a copy of the Estonian Independent. By the way, again, as Vello said, we thought we would be in a different environment here, a much smaller room. So if any of you want to see, so this one's actually from November. But I saw one of these, found the address in the back, and went to the press building there in Pärnu. I walked up, and there I met Vello and Tarmo Tammerk, the paper's editors, and they just on the spot, I think it was probably on the spot, offered me a job. Maybe they put me through a trial, I don't remember that part. Again, we hoped that Tarmo would be here on the panel with us. Here he is today. He is, as Vello mentioned, Estonian Public Broadcasting's ombudsman, Rahvusringhäälingu ajakirjanduseetika nõunik. And here is Tarmo in 1992, there on the far left. And if it's okay, here's Vello in 1990. You see, I knew they would laugh, and I was waiting for that, right? This is from the Estonian Independent from an issue in December 1990, when, as he mentioned, he left. Here's the staff of the Baltic Independent a little bit later, in 1995. Edward, I don't think you were there. I was not there. Vello was visiting, I suppose, from Colombia. And there's Tarmo, and the back, and Lisa is right there on the left. So this is Shri and me in the offices of the Estonian Telegraph Agency. I think this is the 7th, not the 8th floor. And yeah. Okay, so I just want to give a little bit of the background that Vello covered here. And part of this involves the work, which is really the most from the point of view of understanding the influence of perestroika, really the real story is what happens between 1985 and 1990. Tarmo sent some text that we can use for this panel, and I'd like to just use his words here now for just a couple minutes. Tarmo sent us this text. I applied for the post of translator or correspondent at the Periodica Publishers, which was the state publishing company for cultural and educational periodicals as well as tourist literature. My main job was to translate Estonian language articles from Kodumaa into English for Kodumaa's English supplement. So Kodumaa was this supplement, or this newspaper sent to Estonians abroad, and it had a small English language supplement, just 2 pages, that is one sheet, right, 2 pages. This is how I got to know Liia Oll, who was editor of Periodica. Some articles in Kodumaa, that is homeland, were pure propaganda, quite nonsensical, so I tried to find ways to sideline the most absurd things and replace them with extended photo captions of the first signs of spring and other such innocent stuff. To make the translated pieces more meaningful, I started adding some context, such as Rakvere, a town of 18,000 in northern Estonia. In other words, he's speaking to the audience beyond Estonia. And it got me into trouble because the Glavlit, that is the state agency controlling what could be published, banned the publication of the population sizes of towns other than a few big ones. I was not aware of these restrictions as we were not supposed to add anything to original texts. Over time, I noted that the Glavlit censors were not so attentive anymore, or they didn't know English too well, and it became possible to add not only context, but also original short items about things that reflected the political shifts in the country. To my memory, it only became natural for the divorce from Kodumaa to happen in 1990. The director of Periodic Publishers was quite open to this as we teamed up with the state-owned Estonian news agency, ETA, which Vello mentioned, and moved to the press house Ajakirjandusmaja there on Pärnu maantee. So we are sorry that Tarmo, who's really the key person in the whole this whole endeavor, is not here. So here is an issue, one of the issues of Kodumaa from 1990. And again, I thought we'd be in a different room and that you would actually be able to see what's here on the screen. But here's an article here on page 1 that Tarmo writes, Gorbachev meets Baltic leaders, I think you can see that, pledges full support. And notice he puts that in quotation marks. This is his report following a plenum in Moscow of the Communist Party leaders from non-Russian republics and regions of the USSR, in which Balts present at the meeting met with Mikhail Sergeyevich. And I just want to read a little bit from Tarmo's article. Both Mr. Väljäs, that is Vaino Väljäs, the first secretary, chairman of the Communist Party in Estonia, whom Gorbachev himself had named to that position, and Indrek Toome, the prime minister of Estonia, assured local journalists that Mikhail Gorbachev had given his full support, quote unquote, to Estonia's economic autonomy project. In the message of the meeting, Indrek Toome believes is that Gorbachev wanted to make it clear that the Baltic republics should go ahead, but not forgetting that the progressive leadership in Moscow also needs support. Gorbachev is quoted to have said that perestroika is in its most difficult stage now and needs the consolidation of all reform-minded forces to counter the lining up of conservatives. So this pledging his full support is something that Lisa and Vello here will laugh at because it certainly shows Tarmo's own politics of 1990 and 1991. That is, we'll use perestroika and the space that Gorbachev gives us, and the space and the things that makes possible, but we will never trust him.
5 minutes.
5 minutes, great. So as we go through some of the issues, I just want to give you some of the some image. Here's the very first Estonian independent. And as you look through some of these issues, if one day these will be available online, and we've been talking about how that will be possible through the Estonian online library system, you'll be able to see the determination in Tarmo's mind to move towards succession from the USSR. All right, and I will move. I just wanted to show you several issues. For example, this significant event, an event that really began to highlight the tensions that we had seen in Estonia in 1990. Throughout the first year of its publication, Tarmo and Vello were writing machines, publishing multiple articles in each issue. And I want to emphasize the reporting quality of the Estonian Independent. In this issue here that you see from May 1990, Vello reports on an attempted storming of the Estonian Parliament building on May 15th by radical pro-Moscow Russophones. Vello was actually there that day. I didn't yet know about the Estonian Independent. Trei and I had just come the previous month. The Estonian Independent also bore in mind events in Latvia and Lithuania. Vello reports here, is this the June 13th issue of a meeting of top-level Baltic leaders in Jurmala for the further, quote, for further consultations on their strategy for restoring independence. But plenty of attention was paid also, of course, to Moscow, but not just to the Kremlin, but also to the democratic movement within Russia. Here in the June 8th, do I not have the June 8th issue? June 6th. Well, I'll stay with this image. In the June 8 issue, the newspaper reported on the newly elected chair of the Supreme Soviet of the Russian SFSR, that was Boris Yeltsin, who was seen as a partner for Estonia. There it is. You can see. Whoop! What happened there? Vello, I wonder if you could help. I just need to get down to right. Is it this one? Right there? To the right. Yeah, I see it right there. Whoop. Okay.
2 minutes.
Got it. All right, so we reported on the events in Russia on several levels. This is one of the articles that I began to write in the fall of 1990. And one thing that the newspaper gave me an opportunity to do while my Estonian was still working was to report on stories where I could use my Russian language abilities. For example, in November, I interviewed a Russophone in Tallinn who had been in the leadership of the anti-independence movement called, Intermovement, the Движение. And what I always emphasized was that there were divisions. The Russophone community in Estonia was by no means unipolar. And I will have to admit, part of that, my interest in reporting on the Russophone community was not just because my Estonian was not yet usable in the fall of 1990, was that I myself was uncomfortable with parts of the growing nationalist movement within Estonia, particularly the Congress of Estonia. Maybe I won't have time to go into that here, but I was much more comfortable with the Popular Front, Popular Front's efforts, which were on the whole more popular in Estonia as well. The first time that I was able to go outside of the Baltic to report for the Estonian Independent was December of 1990, when I made a trip to Vilnius, my first time in Lithuania, to report on a joint meeting of the Supreme Soviets, which at some point, Vello, I don't remember what month, we stopped calling them, well, for Lithuania it was already the same because Lithuania declared independence in March 1990, but we stopped calling them the Supreme Soviets, but the Supreme Councils, even though the names in Latvian and Estonian remained the same. Lisa, I wanted to show, There we are. There's the one that you and I reported on together. Baltic leaders condemn Soviet plans to enforce conscription. Again, I hope that we would be in a smaller setting here. Lisa, here you're reporting on the KGB, and no thanks for Estonia. One of the most, I have 1 minute, right? Gorbachev's, one of the really important things were happening in the Baltic and throughout the Soviet Union was February and March 1991, and that was the effort to hold all union referenda. The Baltic superseded those with their own referenda, and we covered this intensely. We covered the effort that the Estonian state made to hold their own referendum before then, and how successful that was, with 77.8% of the population saying that they wanted the restoration of the independence of the Republic of Estonia. And we also covered there's the issues about the referenda. We also covered the vote that Moscow still insisted on holding within Estonia. Where supposedly 95% of the 250,000 participants said yes to the preservation of the Soviet Union. In April, the name of the paper was changed to the Baltic Independent. And I just want to emphasize that the reportage throughout both of the years, 1990 and 1991, are outstanding and are really underused by historians. Here we see, let's see, there's the issues I wanted to show. There we go. When you see the final collapse of the Soviet Union, this was also reported in, of course, the newspaper in August 1991. In conclusion, the full press freedom and creativity that the Estonian Independent and Baltic Independent exemplified emerged already in the waning years of the Soviet period. My own view is that looking at the Soviet Union on the whole, what these people active in social, intellectual, and creativity, the spheres of creativity, were pushing for was a post-Soviet society. There were various images of what exactly this post-Soviet society would look like. And I want to emphasize, no one knew that August was coming. No one knew how or when the Soviet Union would collapse. This energy of the Perestroika period, I believe, was one of protean creativity, and it was peaceful. There were some deaths, yes, a few in Lithuania and in Latvia, and that was tragic. But on the whole, this was a peaceful transition. For this, we all today can see as something we can be very grateful for. And in this sense, Perestroika was indeed successful. Thanks.
Thank you. Good. Thank you, Brad. A number of issues also about personal reflections and what we were actually doing there. Another perspective will come from Lisa Trei, who I've already introduced in one form or another. Do you need to? Yeah, you can. Why don't you start talking and I'll see what I can.
So my name is Lisa Trei. Whoops. Okay. My name is Lisa Trei, and I am not an academic, even though I've spent most of my career in academia. I'm a journalist, and I went to Estonia in 1990 because I had graduated recently from Columbia University Journalism School 3 years earlier, and I had been working as a reporter in Florida and Connecticut, and so much was happening in the Soviet Union. My colleagues who had been at Columbia were going to Moscow. Nobody was going to the Baltic states. And I thought, okay, I'm Estonian American, even though I didn't grow up in the Estonian American community. I didn't speak Estonian at all, but I thought, let me go there. I figured I'd go for 6 months, write some stories, and then and that would be it. I ended up staying 6 years, and it did change my life. But what happened was, so I have 3 roles while I lived in Estonia. The way that I ended up there was that, hang on, here we go. I worked in 3 roles. I was a foreign correspondent, a university lecturer at Tartu, and a copy editor at the Estonian Independent. And around in the spring of 1990, Marju Lauristin, who was one of the leaders of the Popular Front, and that's my task pass, which you needed to get into anything back in the day. and it was incredibly useful. So Maria Lauristin was one of the leaders of the Popular Front. She was also chair of the journalism department at Tartu at the time. And she came, along with other members of the Popular Front, Dara Farina, to the States to try and drum up support for Baltic independence. She gave a lecture at Columbia, and my former professor said, you should come down and listen to her. Well, I did, and while I was there, on the spot, she and my professor set up an exchange between Columbia and Tartu. And I went to Tartu to teach practical journalism. And so with my Columbia degree and 3 years experience, even though I had worked as well earlier as a reporter, I ended up in Estonia in 1990. And this was something that was actually happening across Eastern Europe as the Soviet Union began to crumble, or Eastern Europe. There were a lot of examples of Western reporters, and there was even a book that was put out about how to help reporters in these newly liberalizing countries to set up a new kind of journalism. And so I ended up actually working, Columbia University had a program with the New York Times at Charles University, and I worked there as well in the early 90s. So back to Tartu, I had an interpreter. I didn't speak Estonian, and I taught Journalism 101, which is, if anybody has been to school in journalism, it's very nuts and bolts, very hands-on. Some of my students still are in journalism and went on to big careers in Estonia. So I taught all the things that you learn, story structure, which is exactly what Tarmo at the Estonia Independent was doing. He was creating a new kind of Western style newspaper with the inverted pyramid, and I'll get to that in a couple slides. But I taught everything: breaking news, feature writing, separating news from opinion, very important. In Soviet times, people wrote between the lines. A lot of things had to be interpreted, but we were trying to, separate fact from opinion. And so my students, I had them covering a lot of topical issues. You can see what they are. I mean, this was at the beginning of price liberalization. Black market was very active. There were talongi, there were coupons, there was a lot of shortages. And we also had Estonians, by December, Estonians were being told to just disappear, Estonian young men, so they would not be drafted into the Soviet army. So people were just disappearing into the woods. Just related to this, I ended up having a relationship with Tartu throughout the time I lived in the 90s, lived in Estonia in the 90s. And I got some funding to hold the first investigative journalism conference in Tartu and Tallinn. And from that, I brought together some writers, some Estonian reporters and reporters from Latvia and Lithuania, and I published the first handbook in Estonian, probably the only one. I don't know if there have been any subsequent ones. I have a copy. I found it online, and I bought a copy. So I have it if you want to see. This is my show and tell. But I'm very proud of it. And I did that with funding from the Soros Open Society Foundation. So, did that. And then at the same time, I spent the fall of 1990 at Tartu, continued the relationship, but in the fall, or December of 1990, I ended up working at the Estonian Independent. And that was from a little newspaper article that Tarmo had published in Vabamu in New York City. And my grandmother, my Estonian grandmother, told me about it. She said, "Look, there's a paper. Why don't you look into that?" And I said, "Okay." So reporting, to me as a reporter working in Connecticut, this was much more exciting. So I met Tarmo and we made plans that I would come. And again, I didn't speak Estonian, so I ended up being like the copy editor. And I was also trying to professionalize the newspaper and sort of bringing in that experience I had working as a daily reporter, writing 2 or 3 stories a day for the Hartford Courant, which was the largest paper in Connecticut. Before that, I had worked at papers in Florida. So this, here's the quote from Tarmo, from the same part that Brad talked about. He was trying to do what we call the inverted pyramid, where you have the lead at the top, and then the most important information at the top, and then you go down. in terms of importance. And he said he was trying to do that as opposed to how Estonian newspapers wrote stories. And you can read here that it was like a lot of personal observation mixed in with your emotions, with what was happening. So we were trying to get away from that and just do straight news reporting. So that's what I was working on. And yeah, again, the Estonian Independent, it followed British and US newspaper structure, separating news from opinion. They had letters to the editor, right here. Here's the opinion. Or this is op-ed from the editor, probably Tadmu wrote it. And this was someone who worked at the paper, and he had a first-hand editorial. We did, as it was mentioned, that we did need advertising income, and there was some tension between editorial and the business side. Sometimes we were like, it was suggested that we cover a company or something because they wanted to buy an ad, and so this was a tension that was going on at the paper. I was very sort of strict. I'm a reporter. I'm not going to be influenced by economic arguments. I mean, I think you cover news if it's news, but obviously we were a very small, tiny operation, and trying to survive. So anyway, that's what we did. Oh yeah, and also ads were separate. Okay. Then, so working in the Baltic states or working in Estonia, and I did, we did, as Brad and Vello said, we did cover the other two countries as well, but man, what an incredible opportunity, a life-changing experience. This is a photograph by Tiit Verme, who was an ETA photographer, and it's a Soviet soldier who has crossed over from Pskov during the coup and is on his way to Tallinn in the tanks that ended up in Tallinn. And then this is the day that Lenin was taken down outside the Estonian Communist Party, now the Välisministeerium. That's me and some colleagues, Leelo Linask, who is now very involved in the Estonian emigre community, Estonian American National Council, and Tiia Raudma, who has returned. She's an Australian Estonian and returned to Estonia and has lived there ever since. So we were told, we were all at the office in the Ajakirjandusmaja, and we were told there's going to be some cleaning up happening. And so we all ran over there, and this is what happened. So pretty amazing. Okay, my last role, which was probably the most consequential in terms of like supporting what Estonia was trying to do, was I worked as a foreign correspondent. This was pre-internet, as Brad said, and so I was able to sell similar stories to different news outfits. I worked a lot for Business Week and my old paper, The Current. I worked a lot for the San Francisco Chronicle and Newsday. I also worked for the Moscow Times, which was an independent newspaper in Moscow that was, again, set up by a Dutch journalist with American journalists, including my colleagues from Columbia who had gone on to work in Moscow. And so this is my story, it was a front page story on the Chronicle. But I did that, and then from 93 to 96, I became the first Baltic correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. And at that point, the political story had turned into an economic story. And so I was writing a lot about privatization and crime and just the transition of the economies. So one thing I did, and the reason why the Estonian Independent and then the Baltic Independent was so important, is I didn't speak Estonian, I didn't speak Russian, and so sitting in the Estonian Independent, I could hear what was going on, and I was able to write stories for the Estonian Independent that I then repitched to US newspapers. All the time I always had to think, what's going to be interesting to somebody sitting in the States who probably is mixing up the Baltics with the Balkans that happen constantly, that these countries were not well known. There were Soviet republics, and then all of a sudden they're independent. So anyway, yeah, this is pre-independence, and that's the Estonian independence story, and then the Chronicle story. So, yeah, as I mentioned, there were a lot of challenges, how to make Americans care. I ended up writing, I did a lot of breaking news, especially during the whole independence struggle and the early, the transition. But after that, I did write a lot of features that would be just unusual, that, something that you wouldn't see in the States. I did have to deal with a lot of patronizing Western attitudes towards 3 tiny countries. The worst headline that was slapped on one of my stories, in the States you don't write your own headlines, or at least then for print newspapers, was I did a lot of Baltic wide stories, and the headline on one was "Squabbling Siblings," which to me was very insulting. But anyway, I did that, and then also, even though now it seems like incomprehensible for somebody who's growing up today, calling the US or calling the West was very, very difficult. If you were at home, you could book a call through an operator who spoke only Russian. But ETA, the Estonian Telegraph Agency, had 2 direct international lines that you could call, but that often meant literally like hours and hours of manual dialing because the calls dropped. And plus, on top of that, there was a 10-hour time difference with California. So I was often at the Estonian, or late into the night. I also wrote stories. I mean, I was a journalist first. I thought of myself as a journalist first and Estonian second. And I wrote stories that Estonians didn't like, that were critical, that talked about corruption, talked about the mafia. There was definitely a lot of lawlessness in Estonia in the 90s, and that's now been well recorded. People talk about it now, but at the time it was like, why are you writing anything that could endanger what we're trying to do as an independent country, as a newly independent country? So I did that, yeah. This was, one story I did for Business Week. What happened was that if you had a good editor, you got more stories in papers. And the Moscow bureau chief of Business Week, her name is Rose Brady. She's retired now, but she was very interested in the Baltic states. She did not have a patronizing attitude, and she was really interested in our coverage. So I did a lot of stories for Business Week. But the lead of this is, the future is very bad and black now, and it was true. In 1992, things were bad in the Baltic states. As it broke away from Moscow, like pensions had been paid by Moscow, and then all of a sudden they stopped, and Estonia had empty coffers. Like, how do you help the pensioners who have no money coming in? So, I mean, Brad's already shown this picture, but this is us in '95, and Vello and Vabamu, me on the end, and other colleagues. And then last spring, when we started talking about doing this, we got together, and so this is us last year, and it's wonderful. These are all they're all Estonians, and this is Reet Maran, who worked in marketing. Imbi, she did business. Asta, actually, I don't know Asta, she wrote stories, but she copy editing. She did a bunch of stuff, and they're still anyway. They're still very active, and we get together. So anyway, it was an incredible privilege to be able to cover this period. And as the other other people on the panel have said, it really was an important part of our lives. I haven't stopped. I retired from Stanford last year, and I returned to Estonia to revive my Estonian. I'm a master's student in Estonian Studies at Tallinn University, and I'm also a consultant at Vabamu, Museum of Occupations and Freedom in Tallinn. And I developed this online exhibit last year with a Fulbright grant, and it's online. It's about the Estonians and Latvians who escaped from Sweden in the late 1940s because they feared they would be sent back to their Soviet-occupied homelands. It's the second wave of the 1944 Great Escape. And it's now going to be a physical exhibit this summer. It's been online, and it's part of a larger global Estonian exhibition, and you are all welcome to come. Thank you.
Good, and last but not least, Edward Lucas.
Let's get rid of that slide.
Yes, I can.
Well, hello everyone. I'm I'm not an academic, and that's why I don't have any slides. And as those who remember me from the time at the Baltic Independent, when I was the managing editor and the major shareholder, would also say that I'm not only no academic, but I'm not a very good manager, and I'm not a very good businessman. And I don't think that all the wonderful things that we did at the Baltic Independent weren't completely matched by commercial success. And this was exemplified to me after the merger and many further adventures for the Baltic Times, when I met the man who ended up owning it, who was a very rich Latvian called Mr. Zolotarov. And we had a coffee in the Dorchester Hotel in the centre of London, where coffee is not cheap. And he said, I'm trying to tidy up the share register, and you're still down. And originally, I think I owned 40% of the shares. By now, it was 0.0004%, I think. And he said, I was wondering if we could tidy things up. And I said, sure, make me an offer. And he said, well, put it this way. If I pay for your coffee now, we're quits. So that, I think, shows that we didn't make it, we didn't make anybody rich. But it was, I think, a stunning editorial success. I turned up in February 1992, in the sort of darkest weeks of the post-Soviet transition, when we still had the occupation forces in all three countries. The economies seemed to be in free fall, and it was very unclear what sort of support we were going to get from the West, what we were going to get in terms of language and citizenship policies, and really everything was unclear. And I stayed until September 1994. I said I would stay until the last Soviet or former Soviet force soldier had left Estonia, and so we left on the same day, and I felt that was mission accomplished. And I'm going to talk a bit about what I felt that mission was and some of the things that we did and things that we learned. So I thought we had three new missions. The old mission from homeland was obviously keeping in touch with Estonians abroad who didn't speak Estonian anymore, and that was the kind of, in fact, it was a kind of KGB mission, keeping tabs on the diaspora. And I felt, starting in February 1992, that we had really three potential missions. One was to provide what you might call news you can use for English language visitors to the Baltics. And so we pioneered things like restaurant reviews, events, what's on, and that eventually turned into the Baltic Outlook, our colour magazine, which we produced nearly a dozen editions of, which really focused very much on that idea of long shelf life, stuff that you would carry around during your trip to the Baltics. And it was the main competitor for what became Vilnius in your pocket, Riga in your pocket, Tallinn in your pocket, and City Paper. So that was mission number one. Mission number two was to provide a channel of communication within the Baltic states, because I was very struck as a foreign correspondent, travelling constantly between Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, how little the leadership and people in these three countries really knew about what was going on. The old Soviet channels of communication had largely broken down, and there weren't any new ones. And to some extent, that's still occasionally even true today. If you want to know what's going on in Estonia, don't necessarily ask a Latvian or Lithuanian, and vice versa. So I felt that we needed to be a channel of communication. And I was very keen that it should be done in English. I was very struck by the way in which, when people from Baltic states met each other, they were still having to converse in Russian. That was the language had been the Soviet language, and it was still lingering on into the independence era. And I wanted to give that a bit of a push. I came up with what I thought was a rather snappy slogan, which was the paper of today in the language of tomorrow. And one of the many things that Tamu did to educate me was to say, that sounds very Soviet, Edward. We're not going to do that, because, of course, Russian was the language of tomorrow as well. And I'll get on to Tamu's education program in a moment. And the third thing, which was perhaps the most important mission, was to tell the world about what was going on from a Baltic viewpoint. Because But Lisa's brilliantly highlighted some of these nonsense. The tiny Balkan Soviet republics. Nationalists are now in charge, discriminating against the Russian minority. All these sort of what we now see as sort of lingering Soviet and neo-imperialist Russian propaganda tropes were taking hold. And I wanted very much to underline that these are not countries that are new. They haven't gained their independence. They've regained their independence. I may disagree with Bradley here. I think the Congress of Estonia and its counterpart in Latvia and the same approach in Lithuania were entirely right. The historical continuity was very important, and once you saw what was going on through the lens of historical continuity, then it made complete sense to re-establish the national language and to say that citizenship is a privilege if you want to acquire it, but you don't get it automatically just by having been in an occupied country as a migrant brought in by the occupying power. That now has pretty much been established. At the time, that seemed extremely controversial, and it got us a lot of stick from the so-called international human rights community. Now, we've already mentioned Tarmo and Imbi and Asta. I just want to say there were a few other people as well, and I hope some of them may even see the recording of this. We had Lea Oll, we had Heli Mühlberg in charge of the accounts, and also our excellent Lithuanian bureau chief, Daiva Vilkalite. We opened a Lithuanian bureau in the summer of, I think, 93. And of course, Philippe Legrand, who came from a half Estonian, half Channel Islands family, and was an absolutely stellar reporter. And then there were many others, dozens and dozens. I actually tasked an intern with going through every back number of the Baltic Independent and finding everybody who'd worked, who had a byline, and then finding out what had happened to them. And the footprint is amazing. It stretches from law, politics, journalism, academia, business, and elsewhere. And I think one of the great things the Baltic Independent did was it educated the people who worked there, the Westerners who came, often quite patronizing, often with slightly Orientalist views that everything was kind of, because the Soviet Union had kind of trashed these countries, therefore they were essentially backward and slightly ridiculous. And one of the main things that our Estonian colleagues had to do was to rein in sometimes the sense of humour of these rather callow newcomers who thought they would write 5 things that are really funny about Estonians, and most of those didn't get in. We learned also quite a lot of things about privatisation and post-Soviet economics. It was interesting to try and work out who did the Estonian Independent actually belong to. Probably belonged to the KGB or the Communist Party. We sort of declared it to be a shareholding company in a way that I think wouldn't withstand scrutiny from a sort of professional corporate lawyer now. We just sort of said, well, we're going to make it into a company, and so we did. And we also rode the wave of what in retrospect was astonishing good fortune, in that most of our costs were priced at post-Soviet levels, so we were still getting incredibly cheap printing, newsprint, office accommodation, all the things that give newspaper managers nightmares. We were getting at very low prices, but our revenues were coming in bundles by the day, envelope after envelope, with people saying, here's a check for $120, I think was the full price, quite often with strange P.O. boxes from Langley, Virginia. I still remember P.O. Box 00010, Langley, Virginia, and I thought it's really good to see American tax dollars going to keep the CIA informed about what we're doing. But anyway, the money was rolling in, so there was a time when we really did have money to spend, and I think we spent it pretty wisely. We also had this extraordinarily harsh technological environment, and I still remember the day when the modems arrived from some mysterious US government source, and we had modems with error correction that meant that our correspondents would be able to file their stories straight into our bulletin board, and from thence onto floppy disks and then into the publishing system. So from a sort of history of technology point of view, that alone was very interesting. And also the considerable privations of dealing with not just the technological infrastructure, but travelling up and down on the night bus from Vilnius to Tallinn has left an indelible memory in my mind. Also having to get off when you left Lithuania, then getting off again when you entered Latvia, then getting off again when you left Latvia, then getting off again when you entered Lithuania. And at each point, having your baggage looked at and your passport stamped. In this era now of Baltic cooperation, that seems almost unimaginably difficult, but just getting anything done in any way was difficult, and that was a great education. But the most important was geopolitics. We were right. We were right to warn about Russia back in the day.
You're somehow touching one of the screens.
Oh my God!
The
I said I'm no good at technology.
Okay.
Sorry, would you
carry on?
We were absolutely right back in the early 90s to say that Russian imperialism is a threat. And I'm so pleased that we covered the Karaganov Doctrine, which was the idea that being a Russian speaker is a political category. Hands up everyone in this audience who speaks Russian. Okay, so please note, Mr. Putin, we are not a political category. We do not need to be defended. But getting that simple idea across is there is no such thing as a, quote, homogenous Russian minority. It's not a political category. It doesn't need Russian protection. That was super important. Getting the Soviet troops out and also driving home the idea that they're not necessarily allowed to stay just because they've lived here for a long time. And I wish, in retrospect, we'd been a bit tougher on some of those military pensioners who weren't really pensioners. Being very tough on internal security issues, the various mutinies and other shenanigans that were going on. We paid unflinching attention to those, and in retrospect, I wish we'd dug a bit deeper on that too. But it wasn't all hard work. We also pioneered, we had some scoops. We had the fantastic scoop that Rita Dabkote, who had been the American-Lithuanian actually running the info bureau at the heart of the Lithuanian independence struggle, and then went on to run a very successful pizza restaurant, had actually been recruited by the KGB back in the mid-1980s when she was one of the few diaspora Lithuanians living in Soviet-occupied Vilnius, and that she'd then become a double agent, was also informing to the FBI about what she was being made to do for the KGB. That was a world-class scoop, and I'm still delighted to think we had that story first. And we also pioneered satire. And I'm going to finish with this because it was an example of satire that went wrong. Sometimes we did satire that went right. So we satirized a really ignorant Western correspondent who we called Sven Hack. And Sven Hack would always get the wrong end of every story. He would reliably put the names backwards. So he would say, Ivanova Natasha told me with tears in her eyes. We did a good job on satire, but there was one satire which went wrong, and I have to give this, I think in a way it was my greatest journalistic blunder and success. In the Baltic Outlook, we thought we would have a fake column based on leaks from the Kremlin, and we'd create the Kremlin or the intelligence officer in Russia who was in charge of the Baltic states, and he would write a memo to Yeltsin every week, and this would be a way of satirizing Russian misconceptions about the Baltic. And I thought, what can we call this man? What is a name that sounds Russian but is totally impossible in Russian? Now, Russian speakers here, please block your ears, because we called him Oleg Huyevich.
No shit.
Huyevich means son of a prick in Russian. And so I kicked off by writing the memo from Oleg Huyevich to Yeltsin, saying our operations to destabilize the Baltic states, which we now call hybrid warfare, are proceeding according to plan. We have successfully created numerous scandals. We are working with organized crime to make the Baltic seem dangerous, which will discourage foreign investment. We have various diplomatic maneuvers. We're going to delay the departure of the Russian forces in exchange for concessions on language and citizenship. It's all online. You can read the whole thing. Anyway, it was very good, sort of showing both the menace of what Russia was doing, and also I was quite pleased with it. And then we started getting phone calls saying, can you send us the Russian language original of this document? And of course, the trouble was a lot of our readers in North America didn't understand that Huyevich was an impossible name, and they thought this was real. And it was like The Sorcerer's Apprentice. It just took off. And one an emigre Lithuanian paper republished it, but not calling him Oleg Huyevich, but Oleg K, which made it look even more, and they printed it straight. You know, this is a scoop from the paper in the Baltic States about what the Kremlin is up to. And it culminated with me getting a briefing from the Latvian ambassador to Lithuania, who said, I can tell you in confidence that our services have found a really devastating document showing how the Kremlin is plotting to destabilize Latvia. And he started talking. I said, it's not from the Kremlin, and you're not getting value for money from your intelligence services. I wrote this, and I wrote it as a joke. And he said, Mr. Lucas, this is no joke. So this taught us that we had to be a bit careful. But anyway, we didn't just have tremendous fun. We also really made a difference. I think we helped turn around the international perceptions of the Baltic states, not tiny, not ex-Soviet, not failing states, not run by nationalists, not plagued by organized crime, but real countries with real people, and most importantly, with real fears. And sadly, 30 years on, those fears have proved to be all too justified. Thank you.
So there you have it, a range of reflections, personal stories, anecdotes, but also I hope some kind of meat on the bones for what was that era of time. I know many of you have lived it yourselves. So I think instead of us pontificating or patting ourselves on the back any more than we have done so far, let's perhaps see if anyone has any reflections from the audience that you want to ask questions or say something else. Good. Cara Brown, straight. And you're going to get a mic, and then you're going to be able to. Yes,
Thank you for this panel.
So you are. Introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Cara Brown from the University of South Carolina. Thank you for this panel. It was wonderful to go back in time to 95, 96 when I first went to Estonia and picked up, I think it must have been the Baltic Times by that point, and definitely In Your Pocket, which was a handy guide that I thought should spread all over the world, and I guess eventually did across a lot of Europe. I have a question about banner headlines, which made me think about this issue looking at both of your presentations, because you had, Brad, you showed a Baltic Independent that had a non-banner headline of the Soviet Union recognizes Baltic independence, which seems pretty significant, you know, but wasn't a banner headline. And then, Lisa, you had one that had about the tanks, about the Soviet tanks, which was a banner headline. And so I'm wondering just about, given all the momentous, you know, activities each month, how did you make these decisions about banner headlines? What made it to banner?
Okay. Before I pass it on, I want to actually make a. We actually had concrete debates about that, and Edward might be able to verify what I'm about to say or clarify it. But I was coming also from this American standpoint where in a newspaper the headline or title of any article is either dragged out or even written in such a way as that it covers the whole space. If memory serves me correctly, Tarmo Damrak was saying, no, British newspapers actually often have space, that it's just the way it is. And it's also, not necessarily in uppercase all the time and things of that nature. So I think that's at least my initial answer, but I don't know if any of you would have confirm this or change it?
Well, we certainly discussed this a lot, and there's many differences between English and American journalism, and they were often exemplified by Tarmu's admirably puritanical approach that we were going. He used to correct my English, and he would say, that's an Americanism, you can't use it. I remember arguing whether we could say, I'd written truck, and he told me to put lorry, because that was the British word. And but I think on the headlines, I was always desperate to have bigger headlines and have bigger fonts. Soviet layout was often quite small, and we were using a layout guy who didn't really speak English, so we were having to interpret what we wanted in both conceptual and linguistic terms. The other thing that I found very hard to get across was the importance of subbing, that in my world, if a piece doesn't fit, you cut it, and if it's too short, you tell the writer to make it longer. The practice at the Baltic Independent, for most of the time I was there, was you increase the kerning or reduce the kerning, so you either squash the piece up or stretch it out. And this was the sort of standard way of doing it, which I found less than ideal. But the idea that if you have people who are not totally confident English speakers editing texts from non-English speakers, the temptation is not to go in and rewrite it. But I think it would be an interesting PhD subject, would be, did the font size in the Baltic Independent increase over time?
Right, 300 pages about it.
Tamu's thesis was on the way in which Soviet newspapers had abbreviated NATO, by the way, starting from spelling it out in full in the late 1940s, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, then going to N.A.T.O. And then finally NATO all uppercase, and then finally NATO with a capital N and a small ATO. That was his thesis, entirely based on the use in the Morning Star, which was the only English language paper he had access to.
I would just add, you were asked about the banner headlines. Somehow I didn't have these slides. So these are the two issues that covered the collapse of the Soviet Union. This one from August 23rd to 29. Again, this was a weekly newspaper. Overthrow of Gorbachev. How did we say this? I don't remember. Gorbachev ushers in a new wave of violence in the Baltics. And then, so here's another view of the removal, dismantling of the statue of Lenin. Baltic states leap to freedom. And you are, where are you, Lisa? You are here. No, you are in this one, right? By Lisa Terras, Turma volunteers protect key buildings as troops take TV towers. I wasn't here for these two issues. Shri and I were returning from Prague, and on August 19th we were actually in Daugavpils and saw the news, helicopters leaving leaflets announcing that the GKCP was taking power in Moscow. So it was only upon our return that, and I did a story, maybe it was in this one, talking about the views of people on the street in Tallinn about what had happened and what they felt about the movement to independence.
Others, yes, please. Behind, and identify yourself. And
Hi, I'm Ede Tamkivi from Vabamu Museum and also a former journalist in Estonia. So I was wondering, actually, I was too young to remember this newspaper as a reader, but as Lisa, you pointed out, not too many Estonians spoke English at the time, so I'm assuming the audience was outside of the Baltic states. So can you please describe a bit your audience and who were subscribing and how was the process? How did the readers receive the paper at the time where there was no internet?
I mean, it's very important, yeah. So this paper was intended for international diplomats, visitors, and business people. To try and make the Baltic states less opaque, Estonia first, less opaque, and then the Baltic states. And so, I mean, those were the people that we were thinking about in terms of story coverage. And so, but in terms of, I wasn't really dealing with the subscriptions. So, but the thing I do remember that was really big was that back in Soviet times, you could only subscribe to a newspaper once a year, and you couldn't just, it wasn't just like revolving. And I think the Estonian Independent changed that, so you could subscribe anytime. I just remember that.
We did. So we speaking also to the target audiences. I mean, one target audience is also clearly immigrant communities who had the younger generations who didn't speak any of the languages and wanted to follow things along. So all of those people were part of the mix, and it doesn't, and therefore it was I don't know that we had it consciously in our head, like how could we speak to this target audience, that target audience. We just wanted to report on what was going on, and then come what may. In practical terms, what happened, I've mentioned this British Estonian gentleman who offered his services then to set up a bank account here in the UK. Money was then transferred to those accounts. He would send us each week via telex. If you know what that is, a telex, it would then come the list of addresses where we would then send the newspaper, and the newspaper would literally come directly from the printing house to our offices, and on Tuesday evenings the staff would sit there and fold the newspaper, because the newspaper wasn't even folded by the machines. So that was our extra duty, to fold the newspapers, wrap it in a piece of paper with the addresses that we'd printed out on all kinds of on printer. So this was very nuts and bolts, but that went out. But it got out, I think, usually in one piece.
I think we overestimated the appetite for English language news among locals, and BNS was doing a very good job in producing stuff, and they would do it in English and in Russian. And over time, their Russian service grew, and their English service grew, and the Russian service didn't. But we were on sale in kiosks. And this was quite interesting, that the Soviet kiosk network actually was quite good at distribution. And so long as we could get copies to the kiosk headquarters in Riga and Vilnius, then it would reliably, one copy would sit there gradually going yellow. Even in quite remote places, we'd see it there. And people would buy it to practice their English. And occasionally they would turn up in the office in Tallinn, cutting a 6-month-old copy of the Baltic Independent, saying, I've been reading this ever since I bought it. But I think that the main thing was what we made the money really was the foreigners. The advertising was quite different. The advertisers were only really interested in reaching expats. They wanted to reach the diplomats, the foreign business community, and tourists. And so they would be advertising restaurants, hotels, then eventually mobile phones and things like that.
Dentistry,
yes. Dentistry, cheap, and which was of no interest to the people reading it in London or Washington or wherever.
Yeah. More questions, more reflections? Yes, please.
Yeah. I'm Alda Staprans, and from the University of Latvia, and formerly of Latvia's Awakening and the Baltic Observer. So what I want to say is, first of all, nice to see you again, and thank you for this wonderful compilation. It was very, very good. I think somebody should write a book about it. But my question is that I was happy to see that in this compilation you did recognize the Independent is more than just a newspaper. It was the ecosystem, the offices, it's bringing Western-style journalism into the Baltics and all of this. But if you look back, 30 plus years, what would be the one element that had the most lasting impact?
I mean, personally, for me, it may even be two things, but the main thing is the skill that I learned by having to work as a journalist. I was just out of college in 1989, and then went to Estonia, and this experience taught me to write so much better because of the inverted pyramid and everything like that. So I don't know, if you maybe are reading my publications, you may still not agree with that I write any good, but in any case, that's a long-lasting effect that it had for me. And the other thing is really being in those events. I mean, the power of journalism and the task pass to go up and say, I must know, I must get in because the people need to know. It was extremely empowering to do that, and it led to indeed that one moment in May 15th, 1990, being in the Parliament building as the Soviet forces or the Soviet demonstrators were storming the building, and to see afterwards when they had been pushed out that there was this incredible Estonian party going on, and these things. So I will take those things to my grave.
I think.
Sorry. One thing that for me remains is that we were. So Taaramo went to Parliament And this is the night, this is during the coup, and the Estonian parliament is deciding whether or not to vote. And that had been going on, the wait had been going on for like 2 or 3 days waiting. He calls us from the parliament at 11, whenever, like 11:13, and he says they voted. And so we were at the office. The next day we go in, and we're just kind of waiting, like what's going to happen. At that point, nobody had recognized Estonian independence. And then Iceland recognized. And it was incredible. It was like, what? Really? Is this really happening? I mean, there's still troops, there's paratroopers at the airport, and there are the Soviet tanks that have come in, and we have the incident going on at the TV tower. And so Iceland making that declaration was very, very moving, and then it was followed by country after country after country, and we're sitting there, and Kevin Probert Ehaver, I think he was one of our staff members. I think he put, either him or one of the other staff members, put a big poster on the wall, and we started writing down the names of the countries that were recognizing Estonian independence. That, for me, was incredible. And the AP was calling us, and they were trying to interview, trying to figure out what was going on. And so that meant that the rest of the world was getting this news, too. And so that's what I remember.
So I think that we were the one-stop shop for Western journalists coming through, and that was super important, that the first place they would come was us, and we would, sometimes they'd say, can we interview some ethnic Russians? And I'd go and send them to see Valery Kalabugin, who was the most pro-Estonian you could imagine. He'd been a founder member of the Congress of Estonia. And so we were able to sort of have a bit of an impact that way. I suppose that journalistically, the thing, in retrospect, having everything I've learned in the 30 years since, makes me realize how little you actually know. And I was probably about the best informed Westerner living in the Baltics. I was sitting in the Baltic Independent office, traveling constantly, interviewing people. If there were people who were better informed than me, I didn't know them. And yet, in retrospect, we missed so much. We completely missed the story of Estonia getting its extremely important intelligence relationship with Britain, which was sort of game-changing for Estonia. We didn't really get what was happening on the economic side. We saw the turmoil. If you read economics historians, they think that the first Mark Lahr government was one of the greatest reforming governments in the history of transition. It's gone down as the absolute benchmark of how to do it, both in terms of privatization, the currency board, price liberalization. They ticked every box. And we never sat down and wrote a big picture piece saying, gosh, this is actually going to go right. We were always saying, new thing happening, but we didn't join the dots. So I think that it's a sort of cautionary tale in a way. I also think we missed Lennart Meri's speech in Hamburg, which was probably the most important speech ever given by an Estonian president anywhere, ever. And I think it came wrongly for our deadline. So we didn't cover it at the time, and the next week we thought it was too late. This was the famous speech where he warned about Russia, and Putin got up, leading the Russian delegation, got up and walked out, slamming the door behind him. And I can't find any mention of it in the Baltic Independent.
Brad, do you want to?
I would just say, I agree with Vello. There's a certain fearlessness that you have to develop, right, to do this. Also on a prosaic level, I just say it helped my written English, right? Because sometimes we had to write on it. We always wrote at a deadline. Maybe it wasn't a daily article we had to produce, but still, there was a deadline in the week, and I don't know how many days before we had to submit our drafts to you. But yeah, so that it helped my writing skills. But more profoundly, when you spend a part of your life in a place and are part of the history of that place, it provides you a certain kind of ballast. I think you become part of you belongs to that country. And even though I suppose I'm a foreigner, part of me is Estonian because my own life was part of the history of this country, and that's something that's I don't know if I can quite express it as I feel it, but it's profound, and that's with me forever. It makes you a broader person, and for that that multiplicities of being, I'm very, very grateful.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. As the other non-Estonian, we're both honorary Estonians. How about that?
And then I returned. I mean, I came back after I retired, and so I've been living in Estonia now for 2 years.
Yeah. Okay, one last question, Daunis?
I have two quick questions. One is, as a young man living in Latvia in the 1990s, I always looked forward to receiving the Baltic Independent, but it always did seem to have a sort of Estonian bias. Quite frankly, I always got that feeling, and I'm wondering if you're aware of that, or is that just my imagination? That's number one. And the second question is, you know, the 1990s were a time of change, and I'm wondering, do you have anything to say about the tax arrangements of the newspaper at that time, and as they changed as the state consolidated, or is that something better left buried in history?
Okay. Well, what can an Estonian say about Estonian bias? It's natural, it's normal, it's always there, especially in relation to Latvia. But I can't speak to that, in fact, because you guys became the Baltic Independent. That happened in 1991. But I think it's
well, yeah. Tarmo would have to talk about that. I mean, we were reporting as broadly as we could, and then we got some correspondence even.
Yeah, and we did. You're absolutely right, and it was my biggest task, really, was to try and actually make it the Baltic Independent. And we spent we opened a bureau in Vilnius. I actually moved to Vilnius because I thought it would help to have me, and so I commuted to Tallinn, but I was living in Vilnius to try and counter that. And so I think we got more Lithuanian news that way. And then we opened a bureau in Latvia, and that was a struggle because it was quite expensive, and we were selling advertising to keep the bureau going. And I don't think we really cracked. So we had we did our best, but I think that was one of the reasons the Baltic Observer got going. Was clearly there was a gap in the market we weren't covering, and if we had an Estonian bias, they had a bit of a Latvian one, and that was, you know, so if you bought both, you're probably better off. But I think it's still the case, really, that you don't have properly pan-Baltic. Or pan-Baltic Sea news. I mean, everyone thinks of it as a region and the Baltics as a micro-region, but one of the sort of definitions of a region is it should be some kind of common information space, and we're not there yet. You're very unusual as a Latvian in being interested in what's happening in Estonia, and vice versa.
Good. Sadly, I think we're coming to the end, so I don't think we have time for the second part of that question. I think
well, I can see that. I very briefly, I can say that the tax system was extremely onerous. It was, if I remember right, it was a turnover tax at the beginning. So we were paying, and we were very honest, so we paid the old Soviet turnover tax, which was crippling, and then the Mart Laar government brought in the flat business tax, and it did change things a lot. But oddly, we never thought about writing about this in the paper and how good it was. We treat it like the weather, just something that just happened.
Precisely. Good. Well, thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you so much to you. And we'll see if a book comes out.